Detective Mark Harris adjusted his tie as he stepped onto the plane, his weathered face showing signs of years spent in law enforcement. A seasoned officer with over 2 decades on the force, Mark had built a reputation for being tough and no-nonsense. However, beneath his stern exterior lay a man burdened by personal struggles, divorce papers waiting at home, strained relationships with his kids, and an unshakable feeling that life was slipping through his fingers. To cope, he often clung to routine, finding comfort in predictability. The flight attendants greeted passengers warmly as they boarded. Mark took his assigned seat near the middle of the aircraft, a window seat where he could gaze out at the clouds during takeoff. He wasn't thrilled about flying economy. It reminded him of how much simpler things used to be before promotions came with added stress. Still, he tried to focus on the positives. This trip back home would give him time to think, maybe even start repairing some bridges in his life. As more passengers filed in, Mark noticed a woman walking down the aisle. She was tall and poised, dressed sharply in a navy blue blazer and tailored slacks. Her presence commanded attention without demanding it, a quiet confidence radiating from her every move. Mark watched idly as she reached her row, which happened to be just across from his. She greeted the person already seated by the window with a polite smile before settling into the middle seat. Something about her demeanor struck Mark. It wasn't arrogance or superiority, but rather calm assurance mixed with kindness. Still, his mind wandered to judgments he couldn't quite suppress. Probably one of those corporate types, he muttered under his breath, shaking his head slightly. Years of working in urban neighborhoods had left him cynical, quick to stereotype based on appearances, though he rarely acknowledged these biases to himself. Minutes later, the plane began, its taxi toward the runway. As engines roared to life, Mark leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes to block out the noise around him. But his moment of solitude was interrupted when a commotion broke out a few rows ahead. A child's toy fell into the aisle, prompting laughter from nearby passengers as the kid scrambled to retrieve it. The tension eased quickly, but not for Mark. His instincts kicked in automatically. He scanned the cabin, searching for anything unusual, anything out of place. That's when he noticed her again. The woman across the aisle seemed unfazed by the minor chaos, scrolling through documents on her phone with practiced efficiency. Her polished nails clicked against the screen, and Mark found himself wondering what someone like her was doing traveling coach. Was she cutting corners? Trying too hard to appear relatable? Or was she simply practical? His thoughts were cut short as the pilot announced their ascent. The plane lifted off smoothly, climbing higher until the city below became a distant grid of lights. For a brief moment, Mark felt weightless, not just physically but emotionally. Maybe this flight wouldn't be so bad after all. Little did he know, the next hour would test everything he thought he knew about fairness, justice, and humanity itself. Unbeknownst to Mark, the woman sitting across from him carried secrets far greater than he could imagine. Secrets that would soon unravel right here, thousands of feet above the ground, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the world he served. The hum of the plane's engines filled the cabin as Detective Mark Harris tried to focus on the in-flight magazine. But his eyes kept drifting across the aisle, landing on the woman he had been observing earlier. There was something about her that unsettled him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, calm, collected, almost regal, or perhaps it was the stack of official-looking papers she had spread out on the tray table. Whatever it was, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong here, in this cramped economy section with everyone else. His thoughts were interrupted when a flight attendant approached the woman with a small smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," the attendant said politely, "but we've received a complaint from another passenger regarding your phone use during takeoff. Could you please ensure it's switched off completely?" The woman looked up, her expression calm but firm. "I assure you my phone has been in airplane mode since before takeoff," she replied, her voice steady and measured. "If there's any doubt, I'd be happy to show you." Mark watched the exchange closely, leaning forward slightly in his seat. He noticed how the flight attendant hesitated for a moment before nodding and moving on. Something about the interaction gnawed at him. Why did the woman seem so composed? Was she used to being questioned like this? Or was he reading too much into things again? A short while later, the plane leveled off, and passengers began settling into their routines. Some dozed off. Others opened books or laptops, and a few chatted quietly with their neighbors. Across the aisle, the woman resumed working, typing notes onto her phone with precision. Mark found himself glancing at her screen whenever she tilted it slightly toward the light. It wasn't snooping. It was just curiosity. Then came the sound that changed everything. A sharp intake of breath, followed by an audible gasp from the row behind them. A man seated near the emergency exit stood up abruptly, clutching his chest. "Help!" he called out weakly, stumbling into the aisle. Panic rippled through the cabin as nearby passengers scrambled to assist him. Amidst the chaos, the woman across from Mark sprang into action. She unbuckled her seatbelt and moved swiftly toward the distressed man, introducing herself as she went. "I'm Dr. Elena Carter," she said firmly, taking charge of the situation. "Please let me help." Mark's ears perked up at the mention. Her name? Dr. Carter? He frowned, trying to recall if he'd heard it before. Meanwhile, the woman instructed those around her to clear space and fetch water while she assessed the man's condition. Her movements were efficient, her tone reassuring yet authoritative. Within minutes, the man began breathing more steadily, thanks largely to her quick thinking. As the tension eased, murmurs of gratitude spread among the passengers. The flight attendants thanked Dr. Carter profusely, visibly relieved that the crisis had been averted. Mark, however, remained skeptical. What kind of doctor travels without proper credentials visible? And why hadn't she mentioned her profession earlier? His mind raced with questions, each one fueling his growing suspicion. When the commotion died down and people returned to their seats, Mark decided to act. As Dr. Carter made her way back to her row, he leaned across the aisle, his voice low but pointed. "Ma'am," he began, flashing his badge briefly, "I need to ask you a few questions. Privately." Her eyebrows arched slightly in surprise, but she nodded, gesturing for him to follow her to the rear of the cabin. Little did Mark know, this conversation would unravel truths far beyond anything he could have anticipated and challenge every assumption he held about fairness and judgment. Tanto. Rear of the plane was quieter, away from the hum of conversations and the occasional rustle of passengers adjusting in their seats. Detective Mark Harris followed Dr. Elena Carter to a small open space near the galley, his badge still tucked into his pocket but his authority radiating nonetheless. He felt a mix of determination and unease as he prepared to question her. Something about this woman unsettled him, though he couldn't pinpoint why. Was it her calm demeanor, her polished appearance, or simply his own biases clouding his judgment? "Ma'am," Mark began, keeping his voice steady but firm, "I need to ask you some questions regarding your credentials and behavior on this flight." Elena turned to face him, her expression neutral but attentive. "Of course, officer," she replied, folding her arms loosely across her chest. "What would you like to know?" Mark hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by her composed response. Most people would have been defensive or flustered under such scrutiny, but not her. She stood tall, meeting his gaze without hesitation. For a fleeting second, he wondered if he had misjudged the situation entirely, but then his instincts kicked back in. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. "I noticed earlier that you were using your phone during takeoff," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And just now you claimed to be a doctor when assisting that man who fell ill. Can you provide any proof of your identity or qualifications?" Elena's lips curved into a faint smile, one that seemed more amused than offended. Without saying a word, she reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a slim leather wallet. Flipping it open, she revealed an official identification card bearing her name, photo, and title. Senator Elena Carter, State Legislature. Mark froze, his eyes widening as he processed what he was seeing. A senator? On this flight? His mind raced, grappling with the implications. How could he have missed this? Hadn't he seen news clips or articles about her before? She was known for championing healthcare reform and advocating for marginalized communities, hardly someone who would cause trouble on a plane. Before Mark could stammer out an apology, Elena spoke again, her tone measured but tinged with disappointment. "Officer Harris," she said, glancing briefly at his badge. "I understand you're doing your job, but I must admit I find your line of questioning troubling. Are you questioning me because you genuinely believe I've done something wrong, or is there another reason?" Her words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Troubling. What did she mean by that? He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he found himself replaying the past hour in his mind, the way he'd scrutinized her every move, the assumptions he'd made about her based on nothing more than appearances. Guilt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of his conscience. I didn't realize who you were," he finally managed to say, his voice quieter now. "I'm sorry if I overstepped." Elena studied him for a moment, her gaze piercing, yet not unkind. "It's not about who I am," she said softly. "It's about how we treat people. Not just those in positions of power, but everyone. Would you have questioned me so aggressively if I weren't sitting in economy class? If I looked different? If my skin color were lighter?" Mark felt the weight of her words settle heavily on his shoulders. He wanted to deny it, to insist that he judged people solely on their actions, not their appearance. But deep down he knew she was right. His years of experience hadn't erased the biases he carried. They had only buried them deeper, lurking beneath the surface until moments like this forced him to confront them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distant hum of the engines filled the silence as Mark wrestled with his thoughts. Finally, he nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth in her words. "You're right," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I messed up, and I'm truly sorry." Elena gave him a small, understanding smile. "Apologies are a start," she said gently. "But real change comes from recognizing our mistakes and learning from them." As they returned to their seats, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would stay with him long after the plane touched down. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything he thought he knew about justice, fairness, and himself. Back in his seat, Detective Mark Harris stared blankly out the window, though his mind was far from the clouds drifting past. The weight of Senator Elena Carter's words lingered heavily in his thoughts, replaying like an unrelenting echo. "Would you have questioned me so aggressively if I weren't sitting in economy class? If I looked different? If my skin color were lighter?" Her questions had struck a nerve, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself, truths he'd spent years ignoring. Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing across the aisle at Elena. She had returned to her work, seemingly unfazed by their earlier conversation. To anyone else, she appeared calm and focused, but Mark couldn't help wondering what she truly thought of him now. Did she see him as just another prejudiced cop? Or did she believe there was still hope for redemption? His gaze dropped to his hands, calloused from years of hard work and gripping the steering wheel during late-night patrols. He prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone equally under the law. But fairness wasn't always black and white. It lived in the gray areas, the subtle decisions made in moments of stress or uncertainty. And today, he had let bias cloud his judgment. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting passengers momentarily. A child cried out nearby, and a flight attendant reassured nervous travelers with practiced ease, yet Mark barely noticed. His mind was consumed by memories of past encounters, times when he might have acted too quickly, judged too harshly, or failed to listen. Had he been guilty of the same biases then? The realization left him feeling hollow, as though he'd been living a lie all these years. As the turbulence subsided, Mark glanced around the cabin, noticing the diversity of faces aboard the flight. There were families with young children, elderly couples holding hands, business people typing away on laptops, and students burying their noses in books. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles. And yet, how often had Mark overlooked, That humanity in favor of quick assumptions? Elena's voice came back to him, soft but firm. Real change comes from recognizing our mistakes and learning from them. Those words resonated deeply now. Change wasn't easy. It required humility, effort, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. But if he wanted to be better, not just as an officer but as a person, he knew he had to start somewhere. Feeling restless, Mark unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up, deciding to stretch his legs. As he walked toward the rear of the plane, he passed Elena's row again. This time she looked up from her papers and offered him a small, neutral smile. It wasn't warm or inviting, but it wasn't cold either. It was simply understanding. When Mark reached the galley area, he leaned against the wall, taking a deep breath. The hum of the engines provided a steady rhythm, almost soothing in its monotony. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to reflect honestly on his career and the choices he'd made along the way. He thought about the communities he served, the ones he swore to protect, and wondered how many times he had fallen short of that promise. Just then, a young flight attendant approached, him offering a polite nod. "Everything okay, sir?" she asked kindly. Mark hesitated before responding. "Yeah," he said slowly. "I think so. Just thinking." She gave him an encouraging smile. "Sometimes that's the hardest part, isn't it?" Her comment caught him off guard, but it also struck a chord. Thinking, truly reflecting, wasn't something he did often enough. Maybe it was time to change that. As he returned to his seat, Mark resolved to make a shift, not just in his actions but in his mindset. He didn't know where this journey of self-awareness would lead, but one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after today. Not after meeting Senator Elena Carter. Unbeknownst to Mark, Elena had been watching him from across the aisle, her expression thoughtful. She could see the gears turning in his head, the internal battle playing out behind his tired eyes. Perhaps this encounter wouldn't end here. Perhaps it was the beginning of something bigger, something neither of them could foresee. As the flight continued, Detective Mark Harris found himself glancing across the aisle more often than he cared to admit. Senator Elena Carter remained engrossed in her work, occasionally jotting notes or reviewing documents on her phone. Despite her calm exterior, Mark couldn't help but wonder what she was truly thinking about their earlier confrontation. Was she still upset, disappointed, or had she already moved on, dismissing him as just another flawed individual? His curiosity got the better of him. When the seatbelt sign flickered off again, signaling smoother skies ahead, Mark gathered his courage and approached her once more. This time, however, his tone was softer, less accusatory. "Senator Carter," he began hesitantly, "may I speak with you for a moment?" Elena looked up from her papers, her expression unreadable. After a brief pause, she nodded. "Of course, Officer Harris." Mark slid into the empty seat beside her, feeling oddly out of place among the passengers, bustling around them. He took a deep breath before speaking, choosing his words carefully. "I wanted to apologize again for earlier. It wasn't right of me to question you the way I did. I let my assumptions get the best of me, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Elena studied him for a moment, her dark eyes searching his face. Then, to his surprise, she gave a small, understanding nod. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "Apologies aren't easy, especially when they come from someone in your position." Mark felt a flicker of relief but quickly pushed it aside. "It's not enough, though," he admitted. "An apology doesn't erase what happened, and honestly, it made me realize how much I need to change, how much I want to change." Her expression softened slightly at his words. "That's a good first step," she said. "But changing isn't just about recognizing mistakes, it's about actively working to do better. Are you willing to put in that effort?" The question caught Mark off guard, not because it was harsh, but because it was so direct. He hesitated before answering. "Yes," he said finally, his voice firm despite the uncertainty swirling inside him. "I don't want to be the kind of person who judges others based on appearances or stereotypes. If there's anything I can do to improve, not just as an officer, but as a human being, I'll do it. Elena regarded him thoughtfully, her gaze steady. Then maybe we should start by having an honest conversation, she suggested. Not as a senator and a detective, but as two people trying to understand each other. Mark nodded, grateful for the opportunity. For the next 20 minutes they talked about their lives, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Elena shared stories of growing up in a low-income neighborhood, facing discrimination at every turn, yet finding strength in her community. She spoke passionately about her work in the legislature, fighting for policies that would uplift marginalized voices and create a fairer society. In turn, Mark opened up about his own experiences, the pressures of being a police officer, the weight of public scrutiny, and the toll it had taken on his personal life. He confessed how easy it was to fall back on stereotypes when dealing with difficult situations, even though he knew deep down that it wasn't right. As they spoke, something remarkable happened. The barriers between them began to dissolve. What started as a tense exchange evolved into a genuine connection, built on mutual respect and vulnerability. By the time they finished their conversation, both felt a sense of understanding neither had expected when the flight began. When Mark returned to his seat, he felt lighter somehow, as though a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. Across the aisle, Elena watched him go, a thoughtful look on her face. Perhaps this encounter wasn't just a lesson for Mark. Perhaps it was a reminder for her too, that meaningful change often begins with a single conversation. Unbeknownst to either of them, this flight was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would test their newfound connection in ways neither could have anticipated. Just as the plane began its descent, an announcement from the cockpit interrupted the calm atmosphere. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, "we are experiencing some minor turbulence due to weather conditions ahead. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Passengers scrambled to comply, stowing laptops and tray tables as the cabin lights dimmed slightly. Detective Mark Harris settled back into his seat, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. Clouds swirled ominously outside, and the plane rocked gently, a prelude to what was coming next. Across the aisle, Senator Elena Carter secured her belongings and tightened her seatbelt with practiced ease. Her calm demeanor remained unchanged, but Mark couldn't help noticing the slight furrow in her brow, a hint of concern that mirrored his own unease. Despite their earlier conversation, he still felt a lingering responsibility toward her, as though their shared moment of vulnerability had forged an unspoken bond. The turbulence grew stronger, shaking the plane with increasing intensity. Drinks spilled, children cried, and nervous murmurs spread among passengers. Mark gripped the armrest tightly, his knuckles whitening as the aircraft dipped sharply. Beside him, a young woman clutched her rosary beads, whispering prayers under her breath. Elena, however, remained composed, her hands resting firmly on her lap. Sensing Mark's tension, she leaned slightly across the aisle. "It's going to be okay," she said reassuringly, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Planes are built to handle this kind of turbulence." Her words offered little comfort, at least not from the turbulence itself, but hearing her voice steadied something within him. It reminded him of their earlier conversation, of the humanity they had found in each other amidst judgment and misunderstanding. He nodded gratefully, forcing himself to take slow, deliberate breaths. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. A loud thud echoed from somewhere near the front, followed by shouts from both passengers and crew. One of the flight attendants hurried down the aisle, her face pale but determined. "Everyone, please stay calm," she called out, though her voice betrayed her fear. Mark instinctively unbuckled his seatbelt, his training kicking in. "What's happening?" he asked Elena, who had also risen to assess the situation. Before she could respond, another violent shake sent luggage tumbling from the overhead compartments. Chaos erupted as people screamed, some shielding their heads while others braced themselves against the seats. Amidst the commotion, Mark spotted a passenger slumped unconscious in the row ahead. blood trickling from a gash on his forehead, likely struck by falling debris. Without hesitation, Elena sprang into action. "Mark, help me!" she shouted, already moving toward the injured man. Together they stabilized him as best they could, using jackets and blankets to cushion his head and stop the bleeding. Passengers nearby pitched in, holding on to each other for support as the plane continued to buck like a wild animal. Through it all, Mark marveled at Elena's composure. She wasn't just a senator or a leader. She was someone who thrived under pressure, putting others' needs above her own. Her actions inspired those around her, including Mark, who realized how much he still had to learn about courage and selflessness. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the turbulence subsided, and the plane leveled off. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, shaky but relieved. "We've cleared the storm, folks. Thank you for staying calm during that rough patch. We'll be landing shortly." As the cabin slowly regained order, Mark caught Elena's eye across the aisle. Both were visibly shaken but alive, and more connected than ever. Their earlier confrontation now seemed trivial compared to the shared ordeal they'd just endured. But as the plane prepared to touch down, neither could have predicted the challenges awaiting them on the ground, or the impact this flight would have on both their lives moving forward. The plane touched down with a gentle thud, and the passengers erupted into applause, a mix of relief and gratitude for having survived the turbulent journey. Detective Mark Harris exhaled deeply as the aircraft rolled toward the gate, his body still tense from the adrenaline rush. Across the aisle, Senator Elena Carter sat quietly, her eyes closed as she took slow, steady breaths. Both were physically unharmed, but the emotional weight of the past few hours lingered heavily between them. As the seatbelt sign switched off and passengers began gathering their belongings, Mark turned to Elena. "Thank you," he said sincerely, his voice barely audible over the shuffle of movement around them. "For everything, for staying calm, for helping that man, and for talking to me earlier. I don't think I would have made it through this without your strength." Elena opened her eyes and gave him a small, knowing smile. "We got through it together," she replied softly. "And trust me, I'm just as relieved as everyone else." Mark hesitated, unsure if now was the right time to say what was on his mind, but something inside urged him to speak before they parted ways forever. "I know today started off poorly," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck nervously, "but I want you to know that meeting you has changed something in me. You've given me a lot to think about how I see people, how I treat them. I won't forget that." Elena studied him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. Then she nodded. "I believe you, Mark. Change isn't easy, but I can see you're serious about it. That's more than most people are willing to do." Her words filled him with a sense of hope, a fragile yet powerful feeling that maybe he could become the person he wanted to be. As they disembarked the plane together, the chaos of the terminal greeted them, families reuniting, travelers rushing to connecting flights and announcements echoing overhead. Amidst the noise, Mark extended his hand. "If you ever need anything at all, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'd like to stay in touch." Elena shook his hand firmly, her grip warm and reassuring. "I appreciate that, Mark. And who knows, maybe our paths will cross again someday." With that, they went their separate ways, Elena disappearing into the crowd, her confident stride drawing admiring glances, while Mark lingered for a moment, watching her go. He felt lighter somehow, as though a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The flight had been tumultuous, not just because of the weather, but because of the storm brewing within him. Yet he emerged from it with a renewed sense of purpose. Over. The following weeks, Mark threw himself into self-reflection and action. He attended workshops on implicit bias, sought mentorship from colleagues committed to reform, and began engaging with community leaders to build trust between law enforcement and the neighborhoods they served. Each step was challenging, but he reminded himself of Elena's words. Real change comes from recognizing mistakes and learning from them. Meanwhile, Elena returned to her work in the legislature, advocating tirelessly for policies aimed at bridging divides and fostering understanding. Though their lives continued on separate paths, she often thought of Mark and the vulnerability she'd seen in him during their unexpected encounter. It reminded her that even those entrenched in systems of power could grow, if given the chance. Months later, Mark received an email inviting him to speak at a community forum hosted by none other than Senator Elena Carter. The subject? Building bridges between law enforcement and marginalized communities. As he read the message, a smile spread across his face. Their journey hadn't ended on that plane. It had only begun. When they reunited at the event, their greeting was warm and genuine, a testament to the connection forged thousands of feet above the ground. Together they stood side by side, ready to face the challenges ahead. Not as adversaries, but as allies united by a shared vision of a better future.